You are listening to Spell Stoppers, narrated to you by Audiobooks with Keepers of Lost Stories. Chapter 5. Breakfast the next day was almost as bad as dinner. Max came downstairs having woken very early. He had been too excited to sleep much, and when he did, his dreams were filled with shrieking kettles, exploding toys, and shadowy birds that swooped through a sky as dark as ink. Bram was already in the kitchen stirring something on the stove. He was using the same large metal pot that he had used for the stew. The only difference was that this time it was full of something grey and slimy. "Porridge!" announced Bram, splodging a massive amount of it into a bowl and plonking it into the table. The porridge was so thick that Max's spoon stuck upright in it. He tried eating a mouthful, but it was too gluey. So he put the bowl on the floor while Bram's back was turned, hoping that one of the dogs would eat it for him. They didn't. Treacle ambled over, gave the porridge a sniff, and then walked away without touching it. Sardine and Banana wouldn't even look at it, but just sat in their bed staring at him reproachfully. Max gave up and put the bowl back on the table before Bram noticed. Bram was still standing by the stove, his own bowl in hand, happily eating the claggy porridge when Kit stuck her head around the door. The dogs immediately leaped up and rushed towards her, their tails wagging madly. "You've been busy," she said, nodding at the window, and Max realized that the broken pane of glass had already been replaced, as if nothing had ever happened. Bram must have fixed it before Max had come down. "Has the kettle turned up yet?" she asked.
"No," said Bram, between mouthfuls. "Not so much as a whistle."
How about I take Max into yowling? Someone might have seen it." Bram did not reply. Instead, he frowned at Max as if he was worried about him. Max recognized that look. His mother wore it all the time. "Please," he begged. The fact that Bram seemed hesitant made Max want to explore the village more than anything else.
"It's tricky," mused Bram. He turned to Kit. "What if you run into her? She's been getting worse lately, and we don't want her working out who Max is."
"Who?" asked Max, curious. "The keeper of Yowling Castle," said Kit. "The current one's called Leandra, and everyone in the village is terrified of her. Even my dad gets scared if he catches sight of her. We all just try to keep out of her way."
"What does she do?"
"Sets fire to things mostly," said Kit. "She can shoot flames from her fingers. It's horrible. She can turn into an owl too, so you never know when she is going to appear."
"Really?"
asked Max, his voice laced with disbelief. He half expected Kit to burst out laughing and tell him that it was all a joke, but she and Bram looked completely serious.
"She is part of the castle," said Bram. "Its magic rubbed off on her, gave her powers no person would normally have."
"She's awful," said Kit, "but we should be fine at this time of day. They'll all be back at the castle."
"There's more of them?" asked Max, appalled. "More keepers like Leandra?" "Not exactly," said Bram. "There's only one keeper at a time, but when they die they transform permanently into an owl. All the keepers, past and present, are bound to the castle. None of them are able to go more than a kilometer or two away from it."
"So the owl I saw yesterday, was that one of them?" "You saw an owl?" interrupted Kit, looking interested. "Was it Leandra or one of the others?"
"Leandra," said Bram curtly, frowning now. "I'd recognize her anywhere."
"She's after Bram," said Kit helpfully. "She's been trying to get him to spell stop the castle for her, but he won't."
"Of course I'm not going to help her again," bellowed Bram, and he slammed his hand down on the table with such force that his bowl of porridge shuddered. Max looked at his grandfather in alarm. It was the first time he had seen him lose his composure. Bram caught his eye and seemed to pull himself together. When he next spoke, it was in a deliberately cheerful voice. "There's no need for you to go into yowling, Max. There's plenty for you to do here."
"I would like to," exclaimed Max. However dangerous the village might be, the idea of missing out on an adventure was too much for him to bear, especially if magic might be involved.
and although he'd never say it out loud to Bram, he really wanted to get a better look at the castle. He gazed desperately at Bram, willing him to let him go. Max has to see Yowling, cried Kit. If Max is going to learn spell stopping, he's got to see more of the magical world. Otherwise, how will he understand? All right, said Bram, relenting. Just keep your wits about you and listen to Kit. Her family's lived in Yowling for years without coming to any harm. Max scrambled up from the table before Bram had time to change his mind. You have picked an interesting time to visit, said Kit, as they left the farmyard through the old stone gate post and went down the steeply sloping lane. Leandra, the keeper, is determined to make Bram fix the lesson and castle it out. Bram swears he won't help her. Meanwhile, the castle's falling apart. It's all anyone in the village could talk about. How could Bram work on something as big as a castle? Asked Max. It's huge, isn't it? He's done it before, I think, said Kit. Apparently the keepers have always relied on spell stoppers to help them keep the castle going. It's enchanted. That's why there's all that green mist around it. Have you ever been inside? No, nobody has for years and years except keepers. And Bram, I suppose, but he won't talk about it. Kit kicked at a loose stone, which rolled down the steep, bumpy lane. White clouds of cow parsley lined in the grassy verges, and the hedgerows were so green and leafy that Max could not see through them. Have you always lived in Yowling? Asked Max, curious to know more about Kit. For as long as I can remember, said Kit. There's not that many magical communities around, and we need to be beside the sea because of my dad and my sister. Why? Because they're Selkies. Selkies? Max was mystified. They can turn into seals, she elaborated, whenever they go into water. What? Max stopped dead and stared at her. You're kidding. No, I'm not, said Kit irritably. And before you ask, no, I can't do it too. I don't know why, so don't go on about it. She sped up, striding along, so Max had to hurry after her. He fell into step beside her and tried to catch her eye, but she ignored him. And so they both marched along in silence. He suddenly caught a familiar smell. It was the sea. He would know that salty seaweedy tang anywhere. As they came to the end of the lane and out onto a road, he saw the first glimmer of it. The sun was bouncing off the water, and he heard the squawk of seagulls and the murmur of waves lapping the shore. It was already getting hot, and the sea looked cool and inviting. Let's go swimming later, he said to Kit. But she shook her head. You really don't want to do that, she said. All sorts of dangerous creatures live in there. Dad told me you can't just go splashing around. Max fell silent, feeling annoyed. What was the point of living next to the sea if you could not even paddle? Anyway, look, there's the castle, she said as the cove curved round and the castle suddenly came into view. It was impossible to miss. Although it was set almost a kilometer from the shore, it loomed over the bay. Despite the bright morning sun, it seemed to be in shadow, made even more sinister by the clouds of mist that swirled about it. Behind the castle stood a long line of jagged rocks, which cut the cove off from the sea beyond and gave the whole place a closed-in feeling. So the castle is absolutely brimming with magic, continued Kit, warming to the subject. It's been around for hundreds of years, and the village grew up in its shadows. What with the cliffs and the woods and the rocks across the mouth of the cove, Yowling's completely protected from the outside world. It's why so many magical beings live here. Can we meet some? Cut in Max. Kit kept saying how magical the village was, but he wanted to see it for himself. Of course, said Kit. We're nearly there. They were coming up to Yowling now. It had an oddly hushed atmosphere, which reminded Max of the feeling you get very early on a Sunday morning when the whole world seems to be asleep. As the village was nestled into the side of a cliff, all the houses were at different levels, linked by flights of stone steps. There was a narrow dusty road that ran along the seafront and a small pier that jutted out into the water. A big pile of lobster pots was stacked up next to the pier, along with an upside down rowing boat with a nasty splintered chunk taken out of its bottom. Apart from that, the sea front was completely empty. Max peered at the houses curiously. No two of them were exactly the same. Some were crooked and half timbered, with odd little windows and high brick chimneys. Others looked like a confused jumble, as if someone had kept adding extra bits onto them as an afterthought. And the very oldest ones were made from pale salt bleached wood and looked rickety and exhausted, as if they were about to fall down the hill and into the sea. "This is the main street," said Kit, as they climbed up a steep little dotted street with old shop fronts. Every single one looked closed, and curtains were drawn across most of the curved bay windows. Max read the faded shop signs: a fishmonger, an apothecary, and a sweet shop. He paused to look into the sweet shop, but before he could see inside, an unseen hand quickly pulled the curtain across the window. "Why isn't anything open?" he asked. "Everyone's too scared of the keeper," said Kit. "There's only one shop that's still open in Yawling. That one. Over there." Max looked across the street and saw a bow-fronted shop with an assortment of buckets and spades, fishing tackle and pet food piled up in the window. Kit went and pressed a brass doorbell, and a few seconds later there was a buzzing sound as the door unlocked. Max followed Kit inside. He could see at once that it was an excellent shop. Polished wooden shelves ran around every wall, reaching from the floor to the ceiling, and stacked with everything you could possibly want. There were bags of flour, pots of jam, packets of nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate biscuits. Big glass jars filled with sweets sat next to piles of notebooks and balls of string. However, the more Max looked, the more peculiar things he saw. A jar of dried beetles was placed right next to the sweets. A stack of black candles was arranged upon a shelf, and a cage of live mice sat on the sandy floor next to the shiny mahogany counter. Max had just kneeled down to get a better look at the mice when he heard a voice speak just above him. "Some of my customers have unusual taste," it said. Max jumped to his feet at once. A woman was standing behind the counter. Her skin and hair were exactly the same color as the sandy beach, and her eyes were the soft gray of pebbles. She was wearing a long dress that was a bit like a sack and was the same shade as the rest of her. "I'm Pearl," she said, and her hand was held out to Max. "You must be Bram's grandson." "How did you know?" asked Max, in surprise. "Yawling is a small place," she said, "and you look like him." "No, I don't," said Max indignantly, thinking of his grandfather's bushy eyebrows. "We are starving," announced Kit, who had been examining the beetles. "Is the bakery open?" "Of course," said Pearl. She led the way through a narrow passageway lined with more shelves packed with tins and parcels, and into the building next door. It had several ovens at one end and smelled pleasantly of baking. Pastries, loaves of bread, and cakes were cooling on wire racks and were piled up on large plates. There was a long line of bulging brown paper bags, clearly containing yet more baked goods, packed up and ready for collection. The floor, like that of the shop, had a thin layer of sand scattered over it. "Are there any shells today?" asked Kit, turning away from a tray of gingerbread biscuits that looked remarkably like starfish. "I was just about to take them out," replied Pearl. She opened the door of the nearest oven and drew out a tray of pastries that were the size and shape of scallop shells. She tumbled them out into a wire rack. Kit scooped up one in each hand and tossed one to Max. "Be careful," she said. "They're hot." Max bit into the pastry. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, and was definitely worth burning his tongue for. It was filled with a rich custard, and the dough was sweet and flaky, but light as air. "That's really good," he mumbled, his mouth full. Pearl smiled. Max went to take another bite. Then, to his surprise, he saw that the pastry looked as if he hadn't touched it at all. Confused, he tore off another piece, but when he drew it away from his mouth, it still looked exactly the same. "That's why I like them," said Kit, grinning at him. Try a sea urchin next, said Pearl. Before Max could ask what it was, she had placed a round little bun on a plate and pushed it towards him. He tried it. To begin with, he thought it tasted of strawberry, but then he thought it might be lemon. After yet another mouthful, he became convinced it was chocolate. Max examined the remaining piece to see what on earth was actually in it, but it just looked like a plain white bun. How did you do that? He asked in amazement. I'm a sandwich, she said, smiling, then ambled off to attend to ovens. Max looked at Kit, who was staring away at a scallop shell. What? She said, catching a sight of his expression. Paul just said she was a sandwich, hissed Max, keeping his voice low so Paul couldn't hear. I mean, she obviously likes baking, but if she thinks that... Sandwich, interrupted Kit, with a snort of laughter. She said she is a sandwich, not sandwich, honestly. What's so funny? Asked Pearl, coming back over to them. Kit stopped laughing so suddenly that she choked on her pastry. Is this a cafe as well? Asked Max. He desperately wanted to know what a sandwich was, but he did not want Pearl to think they had been laughing at her. She seemed so nice that he did not want to upset her, whatever she was. No, said Pearl, sadly. I've always wanted to open one, but I don't think I'd dare. It might upset Leandra. She scared all the other shopkeepers into closing. She bullies everyone. The only reason I'm able to keep the shop going is because even Leandra realizes that the villagers need to get their food from somewhere. She has never picked on me yet, but she might if I did something as bold as open a cafe. Well, you should, said Max. I'd come along every day if you did. Thank you, she said with a smile. How much was that? He asked, gesturing towards their plates. Nothing, she said generously, since it's your first time in Yawling. Have you seen a kettle? Asked Kit, who had finally succeeded in polishing off one of the nerve-ending shell pastries. A flying one spinning around the place? No, said Pearl, who did not seem at all surprised by the question. But I haven't left the shop. We should carry on looking, said Kit. They said goodbye to Pearl and headed back through the shop next door. What's a sandwich? Asked Max as soon as they were outside. She is, replied Kit simply. Then realizing that Max was expecting more, she gave a shrug. She is not a witch, she said. Not in the way that you're thinking. A sandwich is a completely different thing, like the way that a seahorse is nothing to do with an actual horse. Sandwiches can cast very weak charms, but only if they are near the sea. They are not really able to survive anywhere else. That's why she lives here. So that explains those scallop shells and sea urchins, said Max. The magic wears off as soon as you take them out of her shop through, said Kit. Max wished that Pearl would be brave and keep the opening of a cafe. He wasn't looking forward to a summer of Bram's cooking. Max and Kit spent ages reaching the village for the runaway kettle. They knocked at doors, but hardly anyone answered. The ones who did only opened their doors a crack. They're scared of the keeper, said Kit in explanation, as another door closed in their faces. That's why everyone hides away. Max got brief glimpses of the peculiar people inside. A green scaly skin of claws instead of hands, of strange voices that rasped and creaked, but no one could help them. Yet even as they reached the seafront, Kit continued hunting. I'm sure we will find it soon, said as she pressed beneath the broken rowing boat. Max found Kit's optimism hard to understand. Privately, he was certain that it was a lost cause. He thought about the many disasters that could have befallen the kettle as he walked along the edge of the beach. He scuffled his shoes across the pebbles and shells, stopping every now and then to pick up a piece of jewel-colored sea glass or to examine a strand of seaweed. Then he saw a pair of eyes staring up at him from the sand. Arg! He cried and leaped back. A frog-like face emerged, and then a man-sized chunk of the beach rose up as a person appeared. Max goggled at him in shock. The man, if you could call him that, had webbed, scaly hands, bulbous yellow eyes, and a large rubbery mouth, as if he was part human and part fish. He seemed to find Max every bit as peculiar and was staring back at him with equal surprise. "Hello, Tom," said Kit, coming over to join him. "You're," said Tom, his eyes still fixed intently on Max. "It's all right," said Kit. "He's related to Bram. This is his grandson." "Ah," said Tom, blinking at last. "Welcome." "Thanks," said Max, trying to keep his voice steady. "How did you—" He gestured at the strip of beach from which Tom had appeared. "Live there," said Tom. "But how do you breathe under there?" "Just do," said Tom flatly. Whatever Tom was, conversation did not seem to be his strong point. "You haven't seen a kettle, have you?" asked Kit. "Spewing steam everywhere, whizzing about. A customer brought it in here yesterday, but it got away before we could fix it." "I have," said Tom slowly. "Reckon it was something to do with you lot. It's safe." He pointed his stubby, webbed finger at the heap of lobster pots beside the pier. "Trapped in one of them." "Tom, you're amazing!" cried Kit, and she flung her arms around him. Tom looked surprised but rather pleased. The three of them picked their way across the sand. Kit and Max were telling Tom about how they had lost the kettle, their voices carrying through the still air. They had almost reached the pier when Tom froze, staring with his bulging yellow eyes. "What is it?" asked Kit. But Tom did not reply. Instead, he sank down into the sand, which swallowed him up as if it was a sinkhole. "That was weird," said Max fervently. He prodded the spot where Tom had been with his foot, but there was no sign of him at all. "What is he? He definitely isn't human. And how come he can just vanish like that?" Kit did not reply. She had gone very tense and rigid, rather like Tom, except that she did not have the same option of vanishing in quite such an effective way. "Max," she hissed, "we've got to go." "What? Aren't we going to get the kettle first?" "Not now," she said. "Let's just turn around and go back the way we came." She bugged at Max's sleeve, but he did not budge. He had spotted something. A woman with long dark hair was leaning against one of the wooden posts that supported the pier, watching them with interest. "Who's that?" said Max, but Kit looked as if she was about to be sick. "It's the keeper, Leandra." Max stared. He couldn't help it. He had heard so much about her that he had imagined an impossibly terrifying monster. In reality, Leandra did not look frightening at all. She was quite young and pretty for a grown-up. She had a heart-shaped face, very big eyes, and a cloud of black hair. The strangest thing about her was her clothes. She was dressed entirely in black, an elaborate confection of lace and ruffles that looked completely inappropriate for the seaside, teamed with a pair of heavy boots that were covered in sharp silver studs. "Hello," she called in a clear voice, and beckoned at them to come over. "Oh no," said Kit, looking around wildly as if she was planning an escape route. "We could just ignore her," suggested Max. "No, that would be worse. We'll have to go over there now that she's seen us." They walked towards the spot beneath the pier. Kit reluctantly, Max with more interest. At last he was going to meet the keeper that everyone kept talking about. Leandra was watching them lazily as they approached, still leaning against the pier. Kit and Max stopped a little way away from her, and suddenly Max began to feel nervous. "What on earth have you been up to?" she asked, and gave them a wide smile. Her teeth were very white and her dark eyes gleamed. "I heard you from miles away. Your voices carried all the way to the castle." There was a steady, steely edge to her voice, enough to stop Max from saying anything in reply. Leandra examined her hands, seemingly fascinated by her own fingernails. They were painted silver, extremely long, and the ends had been filled to sharp points. They looked like talons. "You should really be more careful," she said at last. She pointed a finger at Max, and with a shock he saw that a yellow flame was dancing at the edge of her nail. He jumped backwards, and Leandra grinned, then blew the flame out as easily as if it was a birthday candle. Max stared in shock. Kit did not seem surprised. She was just watching Leandra dully, like a mouse trapped between the paws of a bored cat. Then Leandra stepped towards them and tapped Kit on the nose with the same finger that had been alight just a moment before. Kit closed her eyes in despair. "You are the Spellstopper's assistant," Leandra said. "Of course." Kit did not say anything. "And who are you?" she asked, turning to Max. "I'm Max," he said. "So, Max," she said, still smiling, "what are you doing in the village?" "We are looking for a lost kettle," said Max, feeling as if he had to say something. "We are just going to get it, then we are leaving right away." "A kettle?" repeated Leandra, looking faintly amused. "How on earth did you manage to lose that?" "It's magic," said Max, who was starting to feel slightly befuddled. He wished he could get away from her. It almost felt as if she was bewitching him. It escaped. A flicker of interest crossed Leandra's face. "Well, let's go and get it then," she said. "Quickly, the tide's coming in." She linked her arm through Max's and began to walk briskly back towards the seafront. Kit trailed a few steps behind them miserably. "Are you going to spell stop this kettle?" Leandra asked Max. "Can I watch?" Max was feeling very uncomfortable. He had no idea what Leandra was going to do, and her sharp nails were digging into his arm. "I don't know how," he said, wishing that Kit would say something. "That's a shame," said Leandra. "I'm extremely interested in spell stopping. I used to know Bram very well once upon a time. He worked for me. He helped me to keep the castle under control." She sighed, then looked very intently at Max. "What I really need, Max, is for Bram to agree to help me again. It would make such a difference. Do you think you could persuade him?" Said Max uncertainly, wishing that she would let go of his arm. "Because if he won't agree, I'll have to make him agree." Max's skin prickled. He understood Kit's reaction now. All he wanted to do was get as far away from Leandra as possible. At last they reached the lobster pots. Max gazed at the enormous mound of lobster pots. They were wooden cages netted with rope piled up so high that they teetered above his head. There had to be at least 100 of them because the cages were made from such thick rope and were mostly covered in seaweed. It was quite hard to see inside. A black cast iron kettle would be almost invisible. "I'll check this side, you do the other," muttered Kit. They went to the opposite sides of the mound and started examining each of the cages in turn. Leandra was tapping her foot, and Max could feel the irritation radiating off her as she watched them search. "Haven't you found it yet?" she asked impatiently. "Since it's so important to Bram, I think you should let me return it to him. He might finally agree to help me then." Max's heart was thudding in alarm now. He did not know what to do. The last thing he wanted was to give the kettle to Leandra. But what would she do to them if they didn't? He tried to catch Kit's eye to see if she had a plan, but she just stared back at him wide-eyed, looking as panicked as he was. Then Leandra gave a loud, impatient sigh. "This is ridiculous," she said. "This is what I think of your stupid kettle." She stabbed her finger in the direction of the lobster pots, and the huge whoosh, the entire stack burst into flames. The netting on the cages frazzled at once, and the wooden frames crackled as they burned to a crisp. Max and Kit staggered backwards, away from the heat of the fire, flinging their arms in front of their faces to shield themselves from the blaze. From somewhere close by, Max heard Leandra laughing as if she was overcome by how funny it all was. Her pearls of laughter became the hooting call of an owl, which rang in his ears, then died away as Max and Kit were left alone with the towering flames. Chapter 6. It was Tom who put the fire out, at least it was thanks to him. As soon as the owl's cries faded away, Max and Kit saw him running towards them, his feet tapping and flapping, his eyes bulging even more than usual. "My pots!" he cried, skidding to a halt beside them. They all looked helplessly up at the blazing fire. Max's face was flushed from the heat of it. The tide had crept further up the beach, and waves were now slapping about the wooden pots on the pier. Tom turned towards the sea and gave a strange, thrilling whistle. At once a shape rose out of the waves. It was huge, the size of a house, and seemed to be made entirely of water. Max stared at it and thought he could make out a face. There were swirls of grey sea water forming 2 eyes and a mouth. Tom pointed frantically at the blazing fire. The thing gazed at the flames for a moment, then shot a great torrent of water out of its mouth, which cascaded over the flames like a waterfall. It splattered the ground with such force that Max was drenched through with the salty sea spray. The fire went out with a sizzling hiss. Tom gave a funny sort of bow, and the ship disappeared back into the waves. "What was that?" asked Kit. She was also soaked from head to toe and looked as puzzled as Max. "Water spirit," said Tom, as if it was nothing out of the ordinary. He was already sifting through the charred mess of his lobster pots. Max was still staring at the spot where the thing had appeared, rendered temporarily speechless by how unbelievingly strange it all was. Now he realized why Kit had advised against going swimming in the cove. She hadn't been exaggerating when she said it was full of magical monsters, even if this one had seemed quite helpful. There was a sudden screeching noise as the kettle emerged from the shard leaf and tried to fly off. Kit leaped forwards, seized it firmly by the handle, and stuffed it back into one of the few surviving lobster pots. "Got it," she announced triumphantly as she slammed the little door of the lobster pot tightly shut. Tom, meanwhile, had sat down miserably on the low sea wall and was making a faint moaning sound, as if he was suffering from a violent attack of indigestion. "What's the matter?" asked Max. "First my boat, now my pots," groaned Tom. "Tom's a fisherman," said Kit. "If he is not able to work, half of Yowling will go hungry." "What happened to your boat?" asked Max, looking over at the upturned vessel. "Snake bit it," Tom said gloomily. "It can all be fixed," said Kit firmly. "I'll take some of the pots home today. I'll mend them for you. It's the least we can do. She would have never set fire to them if we hadn't brought her over here." Max felt a stab of guilt. He wished he hadn't said anything to Leandra. It was his fault, really. "Much obliged," said Tom, although he still looked woeful. "Let's go back to my house," said Kit, and shoved 2 of the pots into Max's arms, before grabbing 2 for herself. "It's just up there." She pointed at one of the steep, narrow roads that led off the seafront. "Shouldn't we get the kettle back to Bram?" asked Max, nodding towards one of the lobster pots that Kit was holding, where the kettle sat imprisoned amongst a single tangle of rope and seaweed, a miserable curl of steam coming out of its spout. "An hour won't make any difference. It's safe now. That's the important thing. It will only take Bram a minute to fix it. There'll still be loads of time before the customer comes back to collect it this evening." "Okay," said Max, secretly glad that they weren't going back to Bram's just yet. Even though his clothes were unpleasantly damp, he was curious to see what Kit's house was like. They said goodbye to Tom and set off. Tom gave a glum nod in return and continued to stare miserably at the burned heap of wood and knitting. "Next time you see Leandra, don't hang around," advised Kit, as they climbed up some rocky steps. "Otherwise things like this happen." "She's terrifying," said Max fervently. "I thought she seemed okay at first until—" "Yeah," said Kit. "Like I said before, that's why everyone in Yowling hides away so much. If they don't, it's only a matter of time before Leandra does something to them." "But why, though?" asked Max. "Why is she so horrible to everyone?" "I think she's bored," replied Kit. "She's not like the rest of us. She's bound to the castle, so she can never ever leave. I think she takes it out on the village. She's angry, so she bullies everyone." Max fell silent. He was beginning to realize why his mother had been so keen to keep him away from Yowling. It was a far more dangerous place than he had originally thought. They turned down yet another twisty side street, where the houses were even more irregular and jumbled together than the ones Max had seen previously. He glanced into the nearest window and saw a black cat sitting on the sill, staring intently at him with big green eyes. "This is where I live," said Kit, as they reached the most peculiar house of all. The front of it was entirely covered with a thick, leafy creeper, which obscured most of the windows. There did not seem to be a way in, but Kit pushed back a curtain of the climbing plant to reveal A red front door. You live here? Said Max, astonished. Kit just grinned. My mother likes gardening, she said, as she opened the door and went in. Max followed her, and the curtain of climbers swished back into place behind them. Inside were more plants. There were pots of earth lined up along the sides of the dark hallway filled with seedlings sprouting little green shoots. They left the damaged lobster pots and the still steaming kettle just inside the front door. Then Max went over to have a better look at the plants. Careful, warned Kit. They're delicate. I know about plants, said Max confidently. They would make a garden at his school, and he tended to all sorts of vegetables, from pink and white radishes to climbing runner beans. He squatted down on the ground and touched one of the little seedlings. Instantly it shriveled up and died. Told you, said Kit, then broke off as a woman came down the stairs. She had the same auburn hair as Kit and wore a gardener's apron that was covered in dirt. She carried a pair of secateurs in one hand and a bundle of branches in the other. Max got to his feet guiltily, hoping she wouldn't notice the dead seedling. I was trimming the plum drum tree, she said, by way of explanation. The only way of reaching the top is by hanging out of the upstairs windows. There was a series of loud thumps, and a little girl of about 6 tore downwards. Then stopped abruptly when she saw Mac. That's my sister, Ippy, said Kit. Why are you so wet? Asked Ippy, staring suspiciously at Max. That's what exactly I was going to ask, said Kit's mother. What happened? She looked shaken, if not exactly surprised, when they told her. Then she bundled them upstairs to change their clothes. Kit insisted on dragging the lobster pots with her, and Max was surprised to see that her bedroom resembled a workshop. There were all sorts of carpentry tools and even a set of soldering irons. Do you make those things? He asked, his eyes drawn to a collection of wooden boxes, spinning tops, and skittles lined up on the bedroom shelves. Kit nodded. I've always loved making and repairing stuff, she said. I've never wanted to do anything else. That's why I was so keen to be Bram's assistant. Don't you go to school? School? Said Kit blankly. What's that? You don't know what school is? Asked Max, unable to believe what he was hearing. You go there to learn stuff. What sort of things? Asked Kit, sounding interested. Maths and English mainly, and PE, which is mostly just running around after a ball. Oh, Kit's face fell. I thought it might be something to do with learning about magic. Max was beginning to realize just how cut off Yowling was from the outside world. It was like being on another planet. He refused Kit's offer of a spare boiler suit, and instead found himself in a large fisherman's jersey that belonged to Kit's father. It was far too big for him, but he rolled the sleeves up. He kept his own trousers. They went downstairs and out into the little courtyard garden, and Kit's mother brought them some lemonade. The garden was surrounded by 4 high walls, and there was barely room for a table and chair. But what it lacked in space it made up for by the sheer volume of green. They sat in the dapple shade of the newly trimmed plum drum tree, which had dark purple leaves and bright red fruits that looked like strawberries. Each of the walls was completely covered in leafy climbers, and every single window sill was crammed with containers that brimmed with strange plants. Max stared at the nearest one, fascinated. It was full of thick, fleshy flowers which looked a bit like petunias, but they constantly changed color: blue, purple, red, orange, and yellow, so that a whole rainbow unfolded as he watched them. They are called chroma said Kit. You get used to them after a while, although Mum's always finding something new. She's got plants in literally every room in the house. When I was younger, I almost got eaten by a Venezuelan shark fern. Since then, she is mostly stuck to non-lethal varieties. What does she do with them all? Asked Max, thinking of the rows of seedlings in the hall. Surely there is not enough space in here. She sells them, by mail order usually. She'd really like to open a plant nursery here, but she knows it would be a bad idea. Why? Said Max, not thinking. Kit raised her eyebrows. Why do you think? She asked, and Max understood. Leandra. Max felt something tickling in his ankle and looked down. He saw that the thick mat under his feet was alive. Little tendrils were weaving up at him and knotting themselves into his shoelaces. He lifted up his foot and they sprang back at once. Max set his foot back down on the ground again, very gently so as to not hurt them. It's only the seedlings you have to worry about, said Kit, who seemed amused by how careful he was being. The bigger plants are tough enough to look after themselves, see? She grabbed hold of a branch of the plum tree, pulled off one of the knobbly red fruits, and popped it into her mouth. Max was still fascinated by the thick living carpet that was twisting and waving beneath his feet. It was studded with thousands of tiny blue flowers. He leaned toward to touch them. As soon as he did, he felt a familiar pain, as if he had been snapped with an elastic band. The flower withered. What was worse was that it wasn't just one flower. The entire plant shriveled and died so that the whole floor of the courtyard turned a dark, dead brown. Max was horrified. Oh, said Kit, equally shocked. What's happened? Kit's mother appeared in the doorway, holding a fresh jug of lemonade, and looked across the dead courtyard with dismay. I'm so sorry, said Max. I just touched it. I didn't do anything else, I promise. It's fine, she said, although she seemed a bit taken aback. I can easily grow another one. But the more that Kit and her mother told Max not to worry about it, the more Max did. It was like his problems with electricity all over again. Maybe it was getting worse now he was surrounded by magical things. Maybe at this rate he would end up hurting back people as well. It was too awful a thought to contemplate. He had a sudden overwhelming urge to go back home to London so that he could shut himself away in his little bedroom. A horrible feeling of homesickness hit him, and he tried not to let his voice wobble when he spoke next. I think I'll go home, he said. To Bram's, I mean. I'll come with you, said Kit at once. No, said Max. It's okay, I can remember the way back. He saw Kit give her mother a quick look and felt even more like an outsider. Are you sure? She said, and Max nodded. Kit went with him to the front door. It was just an accident, she said. It's fine. Mum can grow another one. Max just nodded miserably. Here, she said, handing him a bag that was knotted tightly at the top. I put the kettle in there. At least Bram will be happy we found it. I will be over again tomorrow, unless he needs me this afternoon. Tell your mum I really am sorry, said Max again. He rolled down the sleeves of the oversized jumper and pulled the roll neck up about his face, so there was no chance he would accidentally brush against the climbers that hung in front of the door on his way out. The last thing he needed was to kill something else. He had hoped that coming to Yowling would mean that he would get rid of his problem. Instead, it just seemed to be getting worse. Chapter 7. Bram seemed to know that something was up as soon as Max arrived back at the farmhouse. After congratulating him for the kettle, Bram made them both a mug of tea and listened as Max told him what had happened on the beach. The moment Max mentioned Leandra's name, Bram almost leaped out of his seat. Tea sloshed all over the table, and Bram did not seem to notice. What did she do? He croaked. She didn't hurt you, did she? She set fire to some lobster pots, admitted Max. You've got to stay away from her. Did she guess that we were related? I think so, said Max uncertainly. Course she did, muttered Bram, more to himself than to Max. She'd have seen you yesterday in the van, wouldn't she? She was flying right alongside the window. Why would you help her with the castle? Asked Max. Kit said you fixed it before. Because that woman is evil, said Bram firmly. I reckon the only way to stop her is to leave the castle be. Hopefully it will go down and take her with it. She's been terrorizing Yowling for 30 years. It's time someone stood up to her. 30 years? Max frowned. Leandra did not look that old. Yep, She just appeared one day, replaced the old keeper. Been a nightmare ever since. The last one was bad enough, but at least he did not have flames coming out of his fingers. The keepers have a different sort of lifespan to us, continued Bram. It's something to do with living in the castle. They always stay the same age. You never see them as children and they never get older. I reckon they spend their early lives as birds. And when a new one is ready to take over, the old one goes, turn backs into an owl. How long have they owned the castle? They are not the owners. They have always just looked after it. They were little more than housekeepers to start with. No, the castle was made by a sorcerer. A sorcerer? The word felt strange on Max's tongue. He must have sounded as if he did not believe it because Bram frowned. Yes, a sorceress. Where do you think all the magical things we spell stop come from? The only people who can create things like that are sorcerers. But you will likely never meet one. You think spell stoppers are rare? Sorcerers are rarer still. You might only get one in 100 years, if that. Brahms rubbed his eyes wearily before continuing. So Sorcerer built Yawling Castle, then left it in the care of the keepers. But I don't think they ever intended to leave it for so long. So now the magic's going bad. It started happening before Leandra's time, but it will be getting worse. Reckon that's why she's been getting worse too. The keepers and the castle are both so bound together. She shouldn't be able to get fire to things like that. Why don't you spell stop the castle then? Asked Max. Take all of the magic away from it. I mean, instead of just fixing it. Too big a job. There's never been a spell stopper alive who would be capable of that. It takes a lot more out of you, eliminating magic completely. The truth is, Max, I'm not even able to fix it. Last time I worked on the castle, the effort nearly killed me. And it's worse now. Leandra's just trying to force me into doing something that I'm not able to do. It's better for everyone, not just for me, but everyone in Yowling. If I don't help her, I will just mind my own business and stick to mending antics. It's much simpler. What about the village? Asked Max. If the castle goes down, don't think it will have any effect on it, no matter how bad the castle gets. There's no sign of anything going physically wrong in Yowling. They are not connected in any magical way. No matter what Leandra thinks, no, the village will be better off without the castle and the keepers. Bram sank back into his chair and fell silent. Max felt even more worried than before. Everything suddenly seemed very serious. Not only was the situation with the castle far worse than he had imagined, but his own problems were getting worse too, since he had now progressed to killing things with a single touch. Is something the matter? Asked Bram, noticing the worried expression on Max's face. I shouldn't have let you go into Wyoming. You don't need to be caught up in all this. It's not that, said Max miserably, and he told Bram about killing the plants at Kit's house. To his surprise, Bram seemed utterly unconcerned. That's exactly what you'd expect from an untrained spell stopper, he said, cheering up, as if Max had just told him some excellent news. But if I kill magical plants, does that mean I could kill magical people? Asked Max, who was not feeling at all comforted. Somehow killing the plants had shaken him more than anything else that had happened so far. No, said Bram firmly. People are completely different. If someone's born with something magical about them, you can't interfere with that. You said you'd teach me how to control this thing I have. And I'm going to, said Bram. Bring me that kettle. We'll start right now. Max went over to the back door, picked up the bag from where he had left it, and brought it over to the table. Just set it down in the middle, instructed Bram. He unknotted the bag and the kettle knotted out. It was covered in soot and looked a little battered with its adventures. But it still gave an angry whistle when it spotted Bram and Max. So the trick is to empty your mind, said Bram, picking it up. Think of lightning conductors, those metal rods that run down the side of tall buildings. The charge passes through them without damaging them. It's the same idea. The kettle began to glow, as if it was very hot, but Bram kept talking. Once you have cleared your mind, you start feeling the energy that's coming from an object, he said. You can feel if it's imbalanced, It will want to return to its original state, the state it was in when it was first enchanted. So you need to let the excess flow through and release it either into the ground or into the air. I prefer the ground, but it ups to you. Every spell stopper has their own technique. The kettle faded back to its original color. Bram was silent for a moment as he examined it. There, he said with satisfaction, and he handed it to Max. Done! Max lifted the lid and peered inside. It looked just like an ordinary cast iron kettle. Try tipping it into your mug, suggested Bram. Max replaced the lid, picked it up, and tilted it above his empty mug. At once a stream of thick hot chocolate poured out of the spout and filled his mug to the brim. No way, said Max in disbelief. He put down the kettle, picked up his mug, and took a tentative sip. It tasted rich and creamy like the perfect hot chocolate. It was incredible. That's what it was supposed to do all along, said Bram, who was grinning from ear to ear. Whatever you must want to drink, it should pour it for you. Coffee, lemonade, whiskey, whatever you like. Wow, said Max, deeply impressed. Do we have to give it back? Afraid so, said Bram. That's how I make a living, fixing things like these. Enchanted objects are very rare, but they are so prized that people will travel from all over the world just to get them repaired. He got to his feet and disappeared for a moment. Max was still intrigued by the kettle. He had just got a glass to see if it really would pour out whiskey when Bram returned, carrying a large cardboard box in his arms. No point starting you on spell stopping till you have got a handle on electricity, he said. Magic's a stronger form of energy, so you will have to get over the electricity thing first. That's why you have been having problems with it. The two are linked, see? Anyway, I had a hunt around the house earlier and found some old things that use electricity for you to practice on. Max peered into the box. It was crammed with all sorts of objects that he would never have imagined Bram possessing, from hair dryers and curling tongs to children's toys. They're mostly your mother's, from when she was younger, said Bram by way of explaining, or your grandmother's. Max knew that his grandmother, Bram's wife, had died before he was born, but he still found it quite odd seeing so many things from the past. It made him realize that Bram used to have a completely different sort of life, one in which the farmhouse had been filled with his family. Max fished out a portable radio from amongst the clutter and turned it around in his hand, examining it. You need to keep yourself calm if you want to turn it on without breaking it, said Bram. Personally, I always find that it's worse when I'm feeling out of sorts. Once I empty my mind a bit, I'm fine. It's exactly the same principle as spell stopping, except the magical objects are a lot more sensitive. Max took a deep breath, preparing himself. Much as he hated to admit it, he was nervous. Years of getting a shock every time he touched something electrical made his whole body tense up in anticipation. He told himself sternly to relax, then flicked the switch to turn the power on. There was a loud pop as the radio broke, and Max felt a stab of pain in his hand. His heart sank. Never mind, said Bram with a shrug. He began to pull on his boots, getting ready to go back out into the workshop. Just keep on trying. You'll get there in the end. It took Max almost a week before he got the hang of it. He ended up breaking every single item that Bram had given him. But finally he was able to switch on his bedroom light using his bare hands, something he had not been able to do for years. He had even managed to call his mother from the ancient telephone that lived in the hallway. It had been the best feeling in the world to hear her answer the phone and yell with joy when she realized that he had been able to call her all by himself. Granted, he had lost concentration and the telephone had short-circuited shortly afterwards, but still, he was definitely getting better. When he wasn't practicing, he spent his time in the workshop, watching Bram and Kit as they worked on a collection of unusual objects. Max's favorite part was getting to see the customers. There was a steady stream of them. Some of them came by car or van, others arrived on foot, and one had even landed a helicopter in the field behind the house, which had terrified the dogs and blown a couple of tiles off the roof. Some of the customers looked quite ordinary. They arrived in jeans and t-shirts or in blazers and shirts, and neatly pressed trousers, and would often look rather embarrassed at the prospect of explaining why they were there. These were the humans, many of whom had inherited pieces from more magical relatives without fully realizing what they had taken on. Others were clearly from the magical community. Most of these people had something subtly different about them, like the mysteriously bandaged owner of the kettle. Even if they looked completely human, Max soon instinctively knew if they weren't. The magical beings all had a different atmosphere about them, as if they were slightly wider awake than other people. They also seemed more at ease in the farmyard, or perhaps that was because the dogs tended to leave them alone after their initial volley of barks. Whenever a regular human arrived, Banana and Sardine would howl constantly, while Triacle would simply stare at the unfortunate visitor while emitting a constant, threatening growl. As the weeks passed, the stock in Bram's workshop slowly renewed itself. The cannon was collected by a nervous man in a dark suit who drove his car into the yard and was so terrified of the dogs that he refused to get out. Instead, they handed him the cannon through the window and he gave them an envelope of cash in return. A china doll who had developed an unpleasant habit of being sick over anyone who touched her had been carefully restored and returned to a plump woman in a hand-knitted jumper who had bright violet eyes and seemed delighted that her family heirloom had returned to singing Scottish airs instead of retching constantly. In their places were a portrait of a stern Victorian gentleman who hypnotized anyone who looked at him for too long, an enchanted music box with a broken lid for Kit to repair, and a sapphire ring that was supposed to bring good fortune to whoever wore it, but had instead started to squeeze the wearer's fingers so tightly that it would go blue and bloodless and almost drop off before the ring would release its grip. At first, Max was content to watch and learn, but now he was eager to join in. He was tired of doing all the boring jobs like sweeping the floor or sorting out boxes of nails and screws. "Can't I help with something?" he begged, when Bram seemed to be in particularly mellow mood. "What about the ring? You said you weren't looking forward to doing that one." "That's because it's vicious," retorted Bram. "I wouldn't let you near it unless you were far more experienced." "Isn't there anything I can practice on?" asked Max. "What about the weasel?" suggested Kit, looking up from the polishing a chair leg with beeswax. "That's been sitting around for ages." "I'd forgotten about the weasel!" exclaimed Bram. "Kit, that's an excellent idea." He went over to the shelf and picked up the stuffed weasel that Max had noticed the first time he had been in Bram's workshop. "Found in the yard years ago," said Bram. "Whoever left it there must have wanted to get rid of it. It's been here ever since." Max could see why it had been abandoned. The weasel was standing on a wooden plinth, clutching a long log between its paws. Its teeth were bared, its fur was balding and falling away in patches, and something about the knuckles of its claws looked uncomfortably human. As Bram brought it over to the workbench, holding it by the very edges of its stand, the weasel ground its jaw and made a dusty gurgling sound. "All it does is try to bite you," said Bram cheerfully. "It's got no magical powers apart from that. I left it as it was because I thought it had a bit more character this way, but it will be good for you to practice on." Max moved towards it, but Bram stopped him. "Try taking off your shoes first," he advised. "That can help when you are learning. Makes it easier for the magic to drain away if you are not used to it." Max kicked off his runners and stood there in his socks. "Remember what I told you before," said Bram. "Once you're calm and your mind's empty, you will start to feel the energy that's coming off it. You want the excess energy to run out it into you and then you let it drain away. Don't get distracted midway though. It will be like getting electrocuted and the magic will just shoot back into the object again. If you touch it and feel that energy is too much, just keep your mind blank and break your connection. That way you won't get hurt." Max nodded. Kit had stopped her polishing and was sitting in the armchair watching him with interest. He slowly reached out a hand and the weasel immediately snaked forward and bit him. "Ow!" yelled Max, rubbing his thumb. A trickle of blood oozed down it. Bram rummaged around for a plaster. "Here you go," he said, handing a crumpled packet to Max. "Thanks," said Max, and wrapped one around his thumb. He took a few more steps, trying to clear his mind again. The weasel looked at him beadily, still gnashing its teeth, its paws flexed on its log as if it was getting ready to spring. "It's stuck on, isn't it?" asked Max, peering at the underside of the weasel. "I mean, it can't jump at me." "No," said Bram, prodding it. "Glued down." "Good," said Max, and reached out again, more gingerly this time. He decided to go for the top of the creature's head. At least that way it wouldn't be able to bite him. As soon as he touched it, he felt a surge running through him. So this was magic. It felt like electricity, a crackling, jolting, powerful surge that shocked through him. He jerked his hand away at once and reeled back, feeling as if he had just been punched in the stomach. The weasel cackled at him wheezily, clicking its teeth together. "Are you okay?" said Kit in concern. "Take a minute," said Bram gently. "Go outside, get some air." "Let me have another try," insisted Max. The pain had subsided a little, but he still felt a numb, tingling feeling in his hands and feet. "I know what to expect this time." He closed his eyes for a few seconds, trying to steady his thoughts. Then he approached the stuffed weasel for the third time, padding towards it in his thin socks. The weasel swiped at him with its claws. It seemed more alert than before, as if its encounters with Max had woken it up, and it chattered at him angrily. Max spun the plinth around and grabbed hold of the weasel's back. As soon as his hands made contact with the rough fur, the energy hit him once more. He tried to do as Bram had said, to channel it down through him and let it drain away. But it was impossible. Pain shot through him, forcing him to cry out. "Let go of it!" yelled Bram. But Max would not let go. Bram grabbed his wrist, pulling him away, and at once the stabbing field stopped. "Don't fight it," said Bram seriously. "Just keep your mind calm." "I was calm," protested Max. He felt angry, as if he wanted to lash out at something in frustration. He kicked at the workbench, forgetting that he had no shoes on. "Ow!" he yelled, as he stubbed his toe. It felt as if everything was against him. He was beginning to think that he would never learn how to spell stop. A part of him had thought that once he had cracked it, he might be able to help Bram, that together they might be able to do something to stop Leandra, but it was no use. Perhaps Bram was wrong to believe in him so much. Maybe he did not have it in him to be a spellstop after all. "You have had enough for one day," said Bram firmly, interrupting Max's gloomy thoughts. "Both of you, get out of here. Do something else. I heard the ice cream man's yowling today. Go down and buy one. Just make sure to keep yourself safe." He drew a crumpled 10-pound note from his pocket and gave it to Kit, while Max put his shoes back on. "Don't worry about spell shopping," he said to Max, clapping him on the shoulder. "You have only just started. You'll get there." Max did not feel quite so optimistic. To be continued.